Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 7 from the 2012 Fide World Chess Championship match. Going into this round, both players remain level at 3 points each, and Gelfand, once again on the white end in this game, opens with d4, non-replying d5, and the first 5 moves of this game are identical to games 2, 4, and 6, where in each of those games Gelfand had the white side. Namely, we saw the moves c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, e3, e6, and knight f3, a6. Games 2 and 4 saw b3 played. Game 6 saw queen c2, but in this game 7 we're seeing c5, a structural change upon watching over b6, a square which has been weakened as a result of a6, and if black is not reacting properly and addressing this pawn being in black's territory, then something like knight a4 and knight to b6 can start to be a great inconvenience to the black queen side, because again this pawn is acting as an anchor point for the white pieces on b6, the knight in particular. Black is of course well aware of this and immediately puts pressure on that c5 pawn with knight on b to d7. And we'll look to, in short order, put even more pressure on it with b6. Something needs to be done about this c5 pawn. It's just too cramping to the black side. And so white anticipates this, plays queen c2. A couple things. Watches over e4, rules out knight e4 stuff, and is, I guess you could say, placing the queen to a half-open c-file, although technically right now it's closed, but again, forecasting this b6 advance and the exchange for the black b pawn and white c pawn. It's the c file which is going to then be half opened, and the queen will be well trained to watch over the c5 square and put pressure on the c6 pawn. Both are significant. If you control c5, there's not going to be a c5 advance, and that's very important to point out right here, because if on the black side you're going to be running with b6, you don't do that to just then be content with how the pawn structure would then be. You do that to then follow up with c5. If you could envision these pawns right here, I could of course make the capture on the board right now, but just doing some mental calculation, if you could envision the black b pawn and the white c pawn absent from the board, what would then be the weak link? It's the c6 pawn, and black will then look to try and get rid of it for a healthy white pawn, namely the d pawn. So after these guys come off the board, black will look to get in c5 and again exchange off the weak link, the c6 pawn, for the white d pawn. We do have this exchange going on b6 and black immediately recapturing, but I had wondered what if b4 is played just to reinforce c5. What might happen is a5. And there is no supporting this pawn because the rook on a is unprotected. We could have from here b5, and with all of this tension between these pawns, they will eventually be exchanged off the board, and black has still been successful. What we might have at this point is something like bishop b7, but the main thing here I want to highlight is how the structure might change, and showing now that the b pawn and c pawn will be exchanged off the board. And even though it won't be the c pawn eventually getting to c5 to exchange itself off for the d pawn, it is going to be exchanged off the board only for the white b pawn. In short, this guy is unhealthy. He'd be content with exchanging himself off with either the white b pawn or d pawn. It doesn't really matter. He just wants to be off the board. So we're not having that. Maybe that's a couple of reasons why. So instead, just b6 and, well, excuse me, not instead of b6. Instead of b4, we're just having c takes b and knight takes b. There are alternatives here. There's queen takes b. I believe that is sidestepped. It's not necessarily bad, but it is avoiding knight a4 moves with tempo on the queen and eyeing the c5 square. For if white is able to control c5, they're preventing the advance c5, and this guy could be a great target on the white side. c5 is an alternative right here. This guy is not going anywhere. He has hit twice, defended 0. He will fall soon enough. And, well, well, this is just another possibility that we could have seen on this move 8 for black, but we don't have queen takes b or the c5 advance, but rather just knight takes on b6, and now bishop to d2 as a follow-up, not running with the routine development of, let's say, the king side, bringing the bishop out, getting castled, but addressing this c file right here, trying to get pieces, the rook in particular, to the c file to immediately put pressure on c6 and try and control the c5 square. So before it's too late, black runs with it, c5, and these guys will be exchanged. Rook c1, again, getting the queen side developed, putting pressure on the c file before the king side is addressed, and the development is going on with the bishop and the king. Now there isn't this capture right here. There's no tricky tactics because of how black can be recapturing and defending the bishop, but now it's a very real tactic. As soon as after c5, as soon as rook on a to c1 is played, now this possibility is present for if bishop comes out, now we have this capture, and it's working out because white has enough defense on the c5 square. So that is the threat right here after rook on a to c1, and so black clarifies the pawn structure in the center. C takes d, white recapturing with the pawn, capturing with the knight does allow eventual e5 moves, and the white pieces are now getting kicked around. So it's just e takes d, and really that's the bulk of the game right there. The different pawn structures, now that the smoke has cleared with that, there really won't be any other significant structural change, and so from here on out it's going to be a case of getting fully developed and getting your pieces to better positions, a repositioning type of thing going on. So that's what we're seeing with these next handful of moves. Bishop d6, bishop g5, this is a better diagonal, placing that knight in a pin. Black castles, bishop d3, threatening to win that h7 pawn, seeing how the knight is pinned. h6 meets that threat, the bishop remains persistent on this diagonal, placing that knight, or keeping the knight in a pin. Bishop b7, more development, white castles, queen to b8, gets off of this diagonal, pressure on the h2 pawn, and well, white has the possibility to go for an imbalance here with bishop takes knight. And what we could see going on if that move were played is knight on, well, excuse me, not knight on c3, just knight to e2, looking to get to this h5 square. That's a very real possibility. Whenever there's a pawn that's isolated, squares on that same file as the pawn often act as good homes for pieces, h5 being a nice home. Even though it's on the edge, it's eyeing f6, and g7 squares right next to that black king, and it could turn out to be a great inconvenience to black. That was a possibility that white does not go for. Instead, we just have no imbalance, really, just negating this bishop's pressure along this diagonal. Welcoming, another way to view it, is it's just the welcoming of white's bad bishop for black's good bishop. And we could say that just by the fixed nature of these pawns and what color complex they're on. In the center of the board, the d pawns in particular. And so now we have rook to c8. This is the only open file, and what's likely to occur when there's only one open file is all heavy pieces to be exchanged off the board, or at least both rooks. So the queen sidesteps any nonsense that might occur on the c file, getting it out of the line of fire on the c file, and eyes the c4 and e5 square. You could see a knight hopping into c4, and maybe a white knight landing to that e5 square, and the queen is placed well to support the e5 move by the white knight, or even defend against black's knight c4 move. And so now some tension, or the tension is resolved between the bishops, so that the queen can now play a role on the d6 square, and the rooks could then be in direct contact with one another. White recaptures towards the center. I guess there is the possibility for capturing away from the center. This might be appealing since it allows for a half-open f-file, but I'm not sure how much significant pressure can be placed against the f7 pawn. I don't know how inconvenient that could really turn out to be. It certainly is a possibility. It's not something, however, that White is running with. It does, if there is some drawback, it is weakening the 7th rank a bit more, and it does open up this diagonal a bit more towards that White king, and this is something that's maybe just avoided altogether, just saying, just staying super solid with h takes g, capturing towards the center. Now queen d6, typical moves at this point, doubling on the c file for White, and on the black side a repositioning, a knight coming to the d6, the d7 square to watch over e5, and it's not really in the spot to really capture a White knight should it go there because of an ensuing fork, but it's more of a just getting better coordinated. The knights now in direct contact with one another, these guys right here. And so now as a follow-up, instead of that knight e5 move, we just have the doubling on the c file, rook on a to b8. This is a half-opened b file, and there's not really a whole lot Black can do to make progress here. It's kind of a little bit of a waiting game, seeing how, okay, eventually this knight is going to move and there will then be tension between the rooks, but, you know, of course it's a little bit better placed on b8 than a8. Again, half-open file. So knight a4, now there's tension between these rooks on the c file, and now this knight jumps into e4. Recognize what the knight is doing and what it's not doing. It's watching over c5. What is it not doing? It's no longer watching over e4. One term that I use in my own games to describe these knights is just counterparts. They're both fighting for the same center squares, and when one leaves, the other will often jump into one of those center squares. That's exactly what we have going on here. Knight plays to e4. One pair of rooks comes off the board. The bishop recaptures on c8, which is struck me as a little bit awkward, but what might happen if the rook recaptures is this. Bishop takes, knight, pawn takes, queen takes, and it's difficult to get this bishop on this main diagonal here. White is up a pawn, and again, the bishop can't be making use of b7, but by just exchanging off one pair of rooks, or in other words, after it captures on c8 and the bishop recaptures, now if there's bishop takes, knight, pawn takes, queen takes, bishop b7 does come about, and there is compensation, or at least better compensation for being down a pawn. This is not something that White goes for. On this move 23, we're seeing queen to c2. But again, just showing what might occur. We have bishop b7, and again, there is compensation in the form of bishop versus knight, and a bishop that is able to contribute in some way to the position now that there's no d5 pawn. And if White isn't careful, just showing one quick variation with, let's say, queen to e3, there's already, let's say, queen takes, or excuse me, not bishop takes knight, but something like bishop c6, putting pressure on the knight. And if the knight moves, the b pawn falls. If the knight is supported, well, you could always just capture. And these guys, although White is up a pawn, it's a not so healthy pawn. And you know, what else would there really be after that bishop c6 move? This is not, again, the most. This is not the greatest reply, queen to e3. But the main point here is just to emphasize the activity that this bishop would now have, since there is no black d-pawn. And additionally, without that black d-pawn on the board, the queen now has some influence on the position. There's possibilities for bishop takes knight and queen takes on d4 at some point. So anyhow, White sidesteps this altogether and goes with the plan to emphasize how bad this guy is on c8. It's just blocked out of the game because of that earlier exchange for White's bad bishop and Black's good bishop. With now these guys remaining on the board, it's a case of a good bishop versus a very bad bishop. And soon thereafter, we could have the position transition into a good knight versus a bad bishop because of this. So anyhow, queen c2 trains herself along the c file and looks for a potential queen exchange, which does occur in a few moves from now. Black's reply g5 is maybe where Black starts to go a bit astray here, looking to maybe kick this knight away so that there's white won't have to, or excuse me, black won't have to worry of a knight posting up on the e5 square, and this knight will then be a bit more free to do some other things. Although I'm not sure what else it would really be doing, but this is a possibility for g4, kicks this knight away, and I guess you could also view it as providing a better flight square for that black king, seeing how this bishop is not far away from directly controlling the h7 square. So in response, we have queen c7. The queens are exchanged off the board, and now this rook is incredibly active on the 7th rank, hitting everything. And it's very difficult to work around this rook now being on that c7 square. If there's some better resistance to be putting up instead of the g5 move, something like bishop b7 might be it. It's still very difficult for black. It does allow for this knight to still take up residence on the c5 square, and if there's pressure placed on it, there's always going to be enough support with b4. Let's say something like this happened with a slight structural change on the queen side. Again, this knight is definitely reinforced enough, and black will always be having to work around this guy right here. And again, this guy is not contributing in a great way. In fact, it's just a great liability. White is always in a position to maybe be capturing that bishop or landing some fork. This guy is a wonderfully placed piece on c5 right now. So we don't enter that particular line. One other note is that after the bishop b7 move, or excuse me, after g5 is played, we do see queen c7. But after bishop b7, queen c7 is actually a blunder because of rook to c8. And if queen takes queen, we have the in-between move. This would just be completely lost, of course, black being up a full rook. That would not be the best continuation at that point, but again, the main thing here is that queen c7 in response to this bishop b7 move, that would be a blunder. So we're not having that. g5 is played instead. Queen c7, queens come off, the rook is active. f6 stops the knight from coming to e5, but does allow for the first minor piece imbalance to occur now. We have bishop takes knight. Okay, this knight is not going to be making use of this square. How else is it to get active? It would like to make use of d2. The bishop is generally better than the knight, but now we just have this, again, this imbalance going on. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes, the knight now repositions, hits on e4 and looks to get into c4, and that's what happens right away. So pressure on e4, it's defended with f5. Repositioning again, knight to c4. Dark square weaknesses, this bishop again not contributing. The rook is tethered to the defense of the bishop, and the bishop can't move. Both of these guys really can't do anything. So a lot of issues here for black to be solving. Knight f6, knight c5, a lot of repositioning. Knight on c5, this bishop is completely paralyzed. It can't go anywhere. This knight dominates that bishop right here, watching over all squares. a6, b7, d7, and e6. In the meantime, knight d5 hits this rook, but it's just kicked away to a7, where it still maintains pressure. It still restricts this bishop. It puts pressure on a6. It cuts off the king. It's doing more than doing more than enough. Knight b4. It's difficult to suggest something good for black at this point. I don't know that there's a way to make significant progress at this point. So we have knight b4, knight e5. These knights will not be chased away from these dark squares. This bishop again remains dead. There's no good solution for these black side, or these pieces right here on the queen side. So knight c2, pressure on d4. Knight c6 defends the pawn, hits the rook, and the rook grabs on b2, but is no longer around to watch out for this light square bishop. After rook c7, this bishop's dead. There's no good solution here. After rook b1, king h2, we now have last try here with e3, and we just have rook takes bishop. There's nothing really else to do. This guy was going to be dead anyhow. So black is trying to mix things up right here with e3 and get at this king in some way with like the knight and the rook, but it's just not happening. After rook takes bishop, king h7, rook check, king h8, there's not really, wherever the king goes, he's going to be in trouble. If he goes to g6, there's knight check. If the king goes here, it's mate. And if the king runs to the edge, well, he's clearly running out of squares. After knight takes here, mate is right around the corner on b7. Or, you know, this king is going to get mated really, really soon if he's going in this direction. We don't have that. The main thing here is that he just backs up. Wherever he goes, he's going to be in trouble. He does decide to go to the corner. After knight e5 and e2, we have knight takes on e6, and both players shake hands, but this time they shake hands because it's resignation. Black, we finally have the first decisive result. Black ends up resigning in this position, seeing how we just have knight to g6 followed by rook to g7 as a mate and two threat. There's nothing that could really be done. There is this possibility for computer-like moves, just delaying the inevitable, in other words, with rook check and then pawn promotes to a queen, king h2, but what do? This same threat is present with the knight check and then the rook coming over here for mate. The only way to really stop it is to maybe just grab that knight, but it's of course still a lost position. One thing that I wondered right here towards the end is why not maybe throw this check in first and after king here, then play here, knowing that there's going to be a check. Well, now we have something which is completely different. There is possibilities for the rook check, the pawn promoting to a queen, and then what do you know? It is black who all of a sudden is the side who's winning. So important to be exact right to the very end right there with those knight moves, and not to run with the check immediately, but instead to first take on e6, and this right here is enough to force Anand into resignation. In fact, the first time, this is the first time that Boris Gelfand has beaten Anand in some time. In fact, the last time being in 1993, and a great deal of tension is now present in this match, and it'll be really, really interesting to see how things follow up at this point with just 5 games remaining, but some might regard that as really just being three games remaining for Anand, seeing how he has 3 more games with the white side, and that is of course the best opportunity to be scoring victories is with the white pieces. So we'll see how things play out. As it stands right now, Gelfand is up 4-3, and we will see what happens in game 8. That is all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.